Welcome to African Americans and Chicago's Outdoors, a program presented by Chicago Public Library in conjunction with our current exhibit From Swamps to Parks, Building Chicago's Public Spaces. I'm Johanna Russ, an archivist here at Chicago Public Library Special Collections, and I curated which features items from our Chicago Park District archives. Our speakers today are Brian McCammack and Veronica Kyle. Brian McCammack is Associate Professor of Environmental Studies and Chair of American Studies at Lake Forest College. He is author of Landscapes of Hope, a Harvard University Press book from 2017, which won the Organization of American Historians Frederick Jackson Turner Award for Best First Scholarly Book in American History, and the American Society for Environmental History's George Perkins Marsh Prize for the Best Book in Environmental History. Veronica Kyle is the Outreach Director of Faith in Place. In her work, she seeks to bring to the table people who are often not involved in conversations around earth care, including African American, Latino, and affluent suburb communities. Kyle's work has been nationally recognized. She was named a 2013 Audubon Toyota Green Fellow and a 2014 Northern America Association of Environmental Educators Fellow. She's also a member of a few Chicago Park District Park Advisory Boards. Today's talk will focus on Chicago's South Side. We haven't forgotten the West Side, but our speakers today have particular knowledge and expertise on the South Side. We're considering a future program discussing African American experiences with West Side parks. The conversation today will be structured chronologically. First, Brian and Veronica will discuss the Great Migration, roughly from 1910 to 1950. Next, they'll cover post-World War II and the Civil Rights Movement, roughly 1950 to 1980. Finally, they'll discuss the late 20th century to the present. We'll spend about 15 minutes on each time period, and then we'll invite questions from the audience. So at the end, we'll ask you to ask your questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, or if you're comfortable, you can put it in the chat. So to get us started, Brian and Veronica, during the Great Migration, why was Washington Park specifically, and the other South Parks more generally, so important to Black Chicagoans?
Introduction, and I'm thrilled to be sharing this conversation and in conversation with Veronica Kyle today, who is doing great work with Faith in Place, which I know she'll talk more about a little bit later. But let's start with history and talk just a little bit about how much the African American Great Migration transformed Chicago. The African American population of the city from in about 1910 was about 40,000, and by 1940 had nearly sextupled to about 250,000. And the share of the African American population of Chicago jumped from 2% to 8%. So it was a period of pretty profound demographic transition. And to address Joe's question about why Washington Park in particular became so important to many of those migrants as well as longtime Chicago residents, we have to talk about racial segregation. About Washington Park on the south side of the city between 51st and 60th Streets, between what is now MLK Drive and Cottage Grove, just west of the University of Chicago, because a whole host of public policies, restrictive covenants, redlining, following redlining ending in the 1960s, all worked to put African Americans, to shunt African Americans into particular parts of the city, predominantly on the south and west side, and we still see those racial segregation patterns today. So this image that I'm sharing right now is an image from Horace Caton's and Sinclair Drake's 1945 sociological study of African Americans in Chicago called Black Metropolis. And it's titled Expansion of the Black Belt. And what you see here is the expansion of predominantly African-American neighborhoods, actually stretching further north than 31st Street, even though that's where this map terminates at the northern end. You notice the 29th Street beach where the race riot of 1919 began. That may come up in conversation later about the contested lakefront parks. But stretching from 31st Street, African Americans continue to push further and further south and further east, and eventually further and further west. So the expansion of the Black Belt was always further and further south in the city. So that by 1930, African Americans predominantly lived in the neighborhoods just west of Washington Park, the Washington Park neighborhood just north of Washington Park. And it was just what was colloquially known as the White Island, just south of Washington Park, that didn't become predominantly African American until after Carl Hansberry, the playwright Lorraine Hansberry's father, bought a home in that subdivision specifically to contest those racially restrictive covenants, and a Supreme Court decision opened that up for African American settlement. So we're talking about Washington Park as a community gathering place for African Americans because so many other parks in the city were essentially off limits to them. They would face racial hostility from white Chicagoans if you tried to venture into those parks that were in predominantly white neighborhoods. So Washington Park by 1930 becomes a community gathering place for African Americans because right next door to predominant African American neighborhoods. And it was a place where migrants coming from the South, and I don't want to sort of reductively characterize migrants as coming from the rural South, because many migrants had experience in major Atlanta, right, worked in the steel mills in Birmingham before making the leap to Chicago. But even with that urban experience, that lived experience of the South would have been much more rural in character, even in an urban setting. It would have allowed them to much more closely connect to nature in the 19-teens, 20s, and 30s. Moving to Chicago, the second largest city in the nation in the 19-teens, 20s, and 30s, would have been a completely alienating and sort of disjointed experience, something profoundly new for most of these Southern migrants. So to be able to connect to more rural, natural type environments was something really special that Washington Park offered in the midst of densely built urban environments. This other image that I'm sharing here is from the late 1930s of two young African-American boys going fishing at a lagoon in Washington Park, right? Fishing, a huge leisure activity in the South for migrants before they migrated. There are limited opportunities for that in a city like Chicago, right? You could go to the lakefront, you could go to these major lagoons in parks like Washington Park, but young and old alike took up those kinds of recreational activities in Chicago, and they did it in places like Washington Park because of discriminatory policies that made them seek out recreation and fight for the right to recreation in these parks. And I don't want to make it seem like Washington Park was a community gathering space from the beginnings of the Great Migration. In fact, it was racially contested space in the 19-teens and 1920s, right? The kinds of white ethnic gangs that actively lynched African Americans in the race riot of 1919 made that contested space and actively tried to prevent African Americans from accessing Washington Park. But African Americans refused to let that deter them. And that's why by 1930, it becomes a de facto African American community gathering space, right? If you look at the lead up to the riot in 1919, which the match to the tinderbox was at 29th Street Beach, much further north than Washington Park. That doesn't mean that there was not racial animosity and racial tensions elsewhere in the Chicago parks. It was all over the city on the South Side. In Washington Park, there were signs that were posted in the summer of 1919 before the race riot happened saying, "We will get you on July 4th," right? These are signs that racist white Chicagoans posted to stake out their turf, saying that this is not African-American space, this is white space, and you are risking your health and welfare if you try to access it. So that story doesn't change until really the 1930s. I've gone on a little bit long here. Veronica, can you speak to the importance of these spaces and migration in particular?
Yes, thanks, Brian, and thanks Chicago Park District and Joe, Chloe, all of you for putting this on. You know, in light of what we have just experienced in this country, I'm sitting here listening to this as a child of the South. My family migrated in '61. And to your point, Brian, from Anniston, Alabama, where those freedom riders got their butts kicked and their bus burned, we had a pit stop in Atlanta. Exactly to your point, my parents began to live in the urban city. My dad was a surgical orderly coming out of the Army at Grady Hospital. I went to Grady Elementary School for kindergarten to second grade. And then we made our way north to Chicago. And of course, you're 7 years old, you don't know what all of this is about, but young parents born and raised in the South and in Anniston, they knew that they needed to get us out of the Jim Crow South, the segregated South, and we're looking for better opportunities. As a matter of fact, I remember my dad saying to me, I'm taking you north to get a good education so you could use your hands, your head, not your hands. And that whole, was symbolic of, the labor, the hard labor that my family had come out of, that tradition of living in the South. So the park, I remember the pit stop, once we got to Chicago, which is very common with any immigrant family, there's usually a host family waiting on you. And in this case, it was my maternal grandfather and his new wife, my step-grandmother, we called my dear affectionately. And I had my mother's younger siblings who were like cousins, but they literally were my aunts and uncles. They lived on 57th and Normal. So Washington Park was the place that they took me because that's where we played. I had never, to your point, ever seen that many tall buildings. Just getting off of the bus. No, we were on a train. The train station, I remember my brother looking up saying, where are we? And I said, I think we're in space. Like I did not know what to make of all of these tall buildings that, were literally up to the sky. But that park was the first pit spot for us as young kids coming from the South, where we felt like we had some familiar. We could run, we could play. I saw people who looked like me. We would play from sun up to sundown. We would come back, we'd be dirty, just in time to eat some dinner, get showered, go to bed, and start all over again. So I'm really, really glad that you bring that up. Not, you take that for granted when you're little. I didn't know the history of Chicago. I didn't know about anything about the riots or any of those things. What I knew is, let's get up and let's go to the park. And that's what you did. And also, it was the first time I saw, Bud Billiken Parade and picnics and all kinds, anything that was happening. I was like, this is the coolest place to slice bread. And speaking of that, the bakery was right not far from there. So you would smell that fresh bread from Butternut Bakery. These were my first early memories of migrating, and Washington Park was that bedrock of nature for us, Brian.
And you mentioned the Bud Billiken Parade, which started during the Great Depression and really took off during the 1930s as sort of a back-to-school event, really focused on children on the South Side. And I wanted to share a photograph of the Bud Billiken picnic in Washington Park. I believe this is 1938. And most of these images that I'm showing are from the Chicago Public Library Park District archives that Joanna was talking about, creating this exhibit for the Chicago Public Library. So you can just see that visually, right? Coming together as a community in these wide open spaces in Washington Park. Washington Park is unique at 371 acres on the South Side, just for the sheer expanse of open space, right? If you look at aerial photos of the South Side, this is as true in 1910 as it is today in 2021. It's very, very different from the densely built environment right outside its borders, right? And that's exactly why Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux designed this park way back in 1871. This is a map, the original design from Olmsted and Vaux, also in the Chicago Park District archive at the Public Library. Washington Park is up here at the upper left, and you can see it connected via the Midway Plaisance to Jackson Park, which is a little bit south and along the lakefront from Washington Park. And you can see all of these different, what I call in my book, microgeographies of Washington Park. These wide open spaces in the meadow. And let me switch to another map from the early 20th century here. Here is a map of Washington Park from the 19-teens. And it's turned on its side here. So the north is actually to the left of frame here. So this expansive meadow, which is where the Bud Billiken picnic really takes advantage of all that wide open space, is countered by the lagoon here on the south end, where the fishing went on. Ice skating in the winter was a huge draw through the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. less so now, but this is exactly what Olmsted and Vaux designed it for in the 1870s, without any inkling of how Chicago would change demographically in the Great Migration, and that it would become predominantly African Americans who were utilizing these spaces by the 1930s, right? Using these spaces that already existed to adapt to the urban environment, adapting their connections to nature that were forged in the South to this new urban environment that could be disorienting and alienating, right?
Right, and I'm so glad you brought that up too. I was talking to some residents, we'll talk later on about the far east side, who actually learned to ice skate when their parents integrated these communities. There was ice skating rinks in all the parks, and these are people now that are in their 60s and 70s, and African Americans who know how to ice skate and swim because of those opportunities. I'm so reason I said yes to even doing this. I had the opportunity, Faith in Place, to create a program that we call Migration and Me, for this very reason, Brian, so that African Americans could tell their own stories about the migration and their engagement with nature coming to the North. Because there also is this stereotype that we don't engage in nature and we don't really care about environmental stewardship, and we have no affinity to nature. Quite the opposite, totally. We migrated from the blanket of nature all around us, green space. I played in the red dirt, Alabama. So coming to Chicago and having a place like Washington Park, that space also became the town hall without walls, right? It was where you built community. It was where you learned where to go get your hair done, where do you shop, where's the best butcher, where's the, and a lot of times it was a breath of fresh air, literally, because people were forced in the tenements, living in very poor conditions. A lot of people piled up in apartments and rooms together. So these outlets were also healthy for our minds, body, and our spirits. And the amenities that people were experiencing, although they were never meant for us, and we later will talk about how the disinvestment, eventually many of them left and no longer exist, which is a shame. Black kids right now in 2021 could learn to ice skate too in their own neighborhoods, by the way. If anybody on the budget committee of the Chicago Park District is listening, you can call me later. We can talk about how to make these things happen again. But also the trauma, the mental health, the trauma that people had experienced in the South. And people talk a lot about post-traumatic stress. Sadly enough, 2021, African Americans are still in current traumatic stress. There is no post. And with what's going on in the country right now, this conversation is so relevant because sadly enough, in some ways, it's still needed. We're still with this, kind of invisible noose on the neck of migrants who are now fourth and fifth and sixth generation. And we're still struggling from some of the same things that they ran away from. We just kind of met them here, and initially not in a subtle way. I think my family I'm shocked when I hear about my grandfather having to fight, to go to the park and fight at the steel mill, and, not being able to eat his lunch in certain areas. So, just thank you for sharing that. And that's why the Migration and Me program is so important. We have to tell our own stories. And I'm glad you're, a storyteller, Brian. I'm appreciating it. I'm glad we're at the table to share these stories, perspectives. And I was listening to a lot of them this week leading up to this conversation.
Thank you both for the introduction to the Great Migration. We're going to move forward in time just a little bit and hit on the post-World War II civil rights era. And I'm hoping you can both talk a little bit about how the parks channeled and reflected Black activism in the civil rights era.
Veronica, would you like to lead off with this one? Talk a little bit about Rainbow Beach.
Yeah, a couple of things come to my mind. I said, by the time we got here, 1961, this was at the height of, King's era. A lot was happening with the civil rights movement. The parks, again, became those places where we gathered. I remember being very young, coming to parks on the southeast side and actually being an observer of meetings with the Black Panthers and other advocates who would meet to strategize about issues around racial equality and rights and how they were going to do things. A lot of support to young kids, you know, the breakfast programs that they were bringing in the church. But the parks became this kind of place, again, where you saw this outlet of the frustration around racial tension. There were, and again, being young, 61, I'm 7 years old. So by the time I'm, 11, 12, junior high and visiting relatives and going to the parks, I'm still not aware of all the current realities of what's really going on. But what I do know for sure is that during those times, Rainbow Beach and many of the other places were really beginning to, we had issues around the wade-ins where people were, I was talking to somebody today and they said they remember putting on their swim clothes, and the kids had organized this. And that's one thing I want to say, youth are the movement of social justice, and nothing has changed with that. We see that with Black Lives Matter. We see that, we saw it then, we saw it now. I lived in South Africa. It was a young students with the apartheid movement that brought it to everybody's attention via the murder of Hector Peterson and his young classmate carrying him down the streets in Soweto. Those young people put on swimwear, got and put on their regular street clothes and organized to go and participate in these wade-ins and come to the beach and have the audacity to be able to get in waters that there was an invisible line of racism and segregation and said you dare not do. And I just want to give you one story in particular. A family friend of ours, his family had moved, and this is the early 60s, and he's thinking, he and his brother, this is paradise, Rainbow Beach. They literally, the house, they could see the beach. I mean, they're right across the street. Just a grove of trees separated them in the house. So he decides to stroll over there. And he said, I stroll over there with my, dashiki on. I'm a young, pretending to be, the militant. And he said, and I'm just meditating, and I look up and I am surrounded by young white men. And I'm being called all kinds of names, and what are you doing here? And he said, just when he knew he was about to have to get the crap beat out of him because he couldn't handle all of them, he sees his brother coming, and his brother has a dog, and his brother lets the dog go, and they scatter. But he was also a part of those wade-ins. Those kids were determined that we live here now, our parents are here now, and we're going to enjoy this beautiful beach. And I moved to South Shore in 2007, and shortly after that, they had the 50-year commemoration of the wade-ins. And to meet some of these now, seniors, elders, so brave to stand up to systemic racism when, quite frankly, many of them said their white classmates they had no problem with. But this is what grown folk do. They would wake up and the next day their friends would be gone. They would move. So as the neighborhood changed, what they also saw happen in those areas were the amenities change. All of a sudden, the ice skate rink, there was no hot house, there was no hot chocolate, there was no ice skating. And so I just want to paint the picture that unfortunately we're still here. I keep going back to that. Like I now live here. I've come in 2007, and those things still don't exist. So there has been no reinvestment, and yet still African Americans have found a way to look at nature as an outlet, as a place for needed respite and mental health. Brian.
I would just add to that those Rainbow Beach wade-ins that you're talking about, as the civil rights movement is cresting in the early 1960s, I believe it happened in 1961, or is the peak of protests in Chicago in 1961. That's just the latest chapter in generations at this point of African Americans, Black Chicagoans contesting these invisible lines, dividing the races, especially along the lakefront. The lakefront is not unique necessarily in terms of park district space that is racially contested, but I would say that the stakes, the tensions were heightened along the lakefront.
Yes.
For a variety of reasons, not the least of which is the desirability of the lakefront, especially in the hot summers before air conditioning became prevalent, as well as a long history of white racist thought, being against any sort of bathing in the same waters across the races. And that racial front just moves south along the lakefront over the course of the 20th century. The map that I shared earlier from Drake and Caton's Black Metropolis, published in 1945, doesn't even have Rainbow Beach on it. It's off the map to the south and east, because those were white neighborhoods at this point in 1945. But if you look at the top of the map at 29th Street Beach, the riot started because of exactly that kind of racial contestation of the lakefront, right? Eugene Williams, a 19-year-old boy, drifts too far south into what was ostensibly, white territory. He is essentially murdered, and then a riot is touched off when a Chicago police officer refuses to arrest the man who threw the rock that killed him, right? Well, that racial front of contesting the lakefront in Chicago's parks just moves further south over the course of the 1930s, so that by 1930, 29th Street Beach, which was so hotly contested in the 19-teens at the very beginning of the Great Migration, that by 1930 is a de facto African-American beach. But the racial conflict just moves south to Jackson Park Beach, also sort of off this map to the south and east. But the 1930s, plenty of Black Chicagoans have memories of a fence being erected across Jackson Park Beach, reserving the more desirable part of the beach on the southern end of Jackson Park Beach, wider, sandier, more space as White Beach, right? The author James T. Farrell, who wrote the Stubbs Lonigan novels in the 1930s and 40s, has a short story about this titled "For White Men Only." It was published in the 1930s, about what happens to African Americans straying south of that line. So that becomes racially integrated space and less contested by the period Veronica is talking about in the 1960s. But you continue to see this shifting geography of racial contestation over parkland space over the course of the 20th century. And you can pick out examples from 2021, right? It's maybe not as brutally racist as it was in the 1960s, but those lines are still there. Certainly in Chicago in 2021, right? And I'm sure you talk to plenty of people in the Migration and Me work and elsewhere who don't feel comfortable in certain city parks in Chicago, right?
Well, absolutely. We were having a conversation today. I had a conversation this morning, letting someone know that I was going to be talking about this. The South Shore Cultural Center, which used to be the South Shore Country Club, which ultimately, after this area became more than 70% African American. Now, initially with the country club, neither Jews nor Blacks could go, and that's right at 7100 South Shore Drive, right? And you couldn't, if you were Black and you worked as a maid or a housekeeper or a cleaner in that country club, you could not stand in front of it to catch the bus to go home. You'd have to cross the street, wait on the bus, flag the bus, hope you don't, get run down to go back and catch it. You couldn't even stand there after you've cleaned the place. Now, fast forward, once the community, to your point, becomes predominantly African American, now the owners of the club decide they want to sell it and auction off all of its beauty. Now, this was the gem of the places in South Shore. And to your point, let's be clear, this is not just about a lakefront. Some of the most beautiful architecture in the city is in South Shore, right? And this was never meant to be a place ever, to your point, where African Americans would dare, other than clean, step foot in. So here, the owners would rather tear it down, sell off all of the prized possessions than to keep it standing. And that's when the fight for the South Shore Cultural Center happen. It wasn't always called the Culture Center. There's an article, and I was just looking, I had this up, Ryan, an article that was written by a Jason Schumer, A Powers for the People. And this was published February of 2019. And he talks about that whole journey, and Harold Lucas and some of the other ones, Renard Hall and, Mr. Dixon and Carol Adams and all these people that literally, had to chain themselves almost to the columns to keep it and fight for it. I think the Park District bought it for about $10 million. And then there became this way of how could this become a palace for the people now culturally. And that came on down to Rainbow Beach, to your point, where and what I learned is that this was happening all over the country. Those wait-ins on 31st sparked, that 29th Street Beach sparked wait-ins all across this country during the 60s, where African Americans were doing this everywhere along lakefronts. And many of them, as you know, and you probably will talk about that, those in the upper middle class actually began to have that community idlewild. That became I call it the Midwest Martha's Vineyard, the inkwell for African Americans that were leaving Chicago, that were, upper middle class, had their own space. Now that's like places like Union Pier and St. Joseph's and other places, but that was another place where people had to create their own safe space to recreate.
If I could pick up on this idea you referenced about the way the Park District invests in some spaces and not others, and you see this pattern of disinvestment in what become predominantly African-American parks. I mean, you can trace that in some place like Washington Park, right, which does become this huge community institution for African-Americans by the 1930s. The kinds of equipment that you saw in Washington Park, like this image from the Chicago Park District archives at the Chicago Public Library that I'm showing, is a very modest playground, right? A set of slides in the 1950s. That was pretty typical for what kids were able to access at some place like Washington Park until 1970, and something called Bynum Adventure Playland was constructed by the Park District, which this is also an image from the Chicago Park District archives at the Public Library. It has a space age theme. It was unveiled in 1970, marked for once a major investment in what was a community space for African Americans. It was hugely popular with kids throughout the 1970s. This park cost $750,000 in the late 60s, early 70s. Way more, right, than the 10 grand or whatever the Park District was typically spending on much more modest playgrounds. There's this great picture from the archives of kids playing on that little planet-like structure at Bynum Adventure Playland. But to speak to this disinvestment in African-American communities, Bynum Adventure Playland was gone by 1990, right? Now, obviously, the kind of equipment that was constructed there was a little outmoded by 1990, but the disinvestment of the Park District after that initial upfront investment, which is actually a boon to the community, actually ends up harming the community, right? That there is no follow-up, there is no maintenance. It's a crumbling structure, Bynum Adventure Playland by 1990, and it's taken down entirely and not replaced by anything that meets the community's needs, right? It's just not replaced.
Right. Listen, I had someone tell me that they woke up one day, they went to bed one day in South Shore, and it was a few white neighbors left on their block, and they woke up the next morning and the whole darn house was gone, Brian. In other words, thus we think about where are the vacant lots, where did all this come from, and nothing else to date, I understand, has ever been put in that space, right? That became a vacant lot. Well, what happens in a vacant lot? People blow trash, whatever. Said their family tried to, pick it up. At that point, they didn't know what to do. Can you get it? I can't buy it. All of a sudden, you see disinvestment, but you forget that it all comes from systemic racism. You know, there's a reason that certain communities look the way they do. There's a reason that certain park benches are broken and, you know, they haven't been, you know, the chessboards or anything hasn't been redone or anything put in forever. I came back from living overseas. I lived in Jamaica for 7 years and South Africa for 4. And I remember coming back and somebody said, oh, you know, summer, you know, I came in the winter, so by summer they said, oh, let's go up to North Street Beach, you know. And I'm like, oh, sure, I haven't been that weird ever. It looked like a private resort that I had just left from Jamaica, you know, cabanas and, you know, everything. And I'm like, wait, is this park? Is this what? You know, is this the same waterfront? Is this the same? And so it's such a stark reality that you know, the darker the melon, the less of the investment. The interesting thing about that, where people need it the most, we have it the least. The level of mental issues around stress, being able to just be sane in the midst of what's happening in this country and its community, and particularly in some communities. I mean, this is where you need a commission to be sitting on the park district and putting mental health experts as well as architects and, you know, psychologists and playground, you know, designers. What do we need to bring back? The other thing I want to say about Washington Park and some of the parks, Washington Park, Jackson Park, Rosenblum, they also had these incredible programs that built around workforce development. You had woodworking and shop and leatherworks, and you could sew. I mean, it was more than basketball. You know, there were clearly skills that you can hone in. You could go there, and these were things that weren't going to be in your home. You relied on that equipment, and I suspect, because I've seen some, I'm not going to call out the parks, in the basement collecting dust, right? We're at a point right now where unemployment is at an all-time high, and how we invest in our youth, everybody's scratching their head. And yet, here are most of our parks on the waterfront now in these communities. Participant levels are so low. The marketing doesn't exist. If you don't know what's down there, if you don't know anybody in that door, you don't know what's being offered. So I really think this conversation, we have a chance. Park District officials, if you're listening, illustrious Mayor Lightfoot, I love her. I was on the Environmental Transition Committee for the first 100 days. This is an opportunity to really invest. When we talk about reparations for African Americans, somebody said we also need institutional reparations. We need to reinvest, and in some ways, invest for the first time, because to be honest, Brian, to your point, many of the parks that were, once they became us, never were again. So there was never the investment. It just slowly just, you know, denigrated. So I just wanted to put that out there. I think it's really important that we have this conversation about what was, but how do we go? How do we move forward to what we need to do now?
Yeah, Veronica, thank you. I think you set us up perfectly to move into the final third, kind of the 1980s to the present. And how can the history we've talked about help us understand the way communities of color engage with parks today?
Brian, I'll let you start.
I mean, I'll start with just a little bit of historical context and the kinds of inequities that we've been talking about that are longstanding, dating to the very beginning of the Great Migration, when the city's African-American population really started growing, to the present day. These were addressed by, or you know, public officials tried to address them at many points in Chicago's history. And I think in 2021, we are still dealing with the legacy of those failures, right? The Chicago Park District had to enter into a consent decree with the Justice Department in 1983 because of these well-documented inequalities, that in terms of facilities, the kinds of programming that you're talking about, Veronica, that those were profoundly unequal, right? That they existed in white neighborhoods in the city. They did not exist in Black and Latinx neighborhoods in the city at the same level. both in terms of the actual facilities, the number of basketball courts and baseball diamonds, as well as the kind of staffing and programming that was offered in those parks. Well, the park district was released from that consent decree later on in the 1980s, but clearly has not fundamentally resolved those inequalities. I mean, that's, whatever you think of the Friends of the Parks report that came out a few years ago, I believe it was 2018, basically looked back to the consent decree and looked back to this longer history dating to the early 20th century and said, we still haven't solved these problems, right? There are still these profound inequities. And the Chicago Park District came back with a response sort of contesting the methodology and the figures of the Friends of the Parks. But I think if you talk to African Americans on the South Side or the West Side, if you talk to Latinx Chicagoans in Pilsen and Little Village, they can just tell you their lived experience of those spaces is one of inequalities, right? Very different from my lived experience on the far north side of the city. So, this history of inequality is sort of frustratingly persistent, despite the persistent activism of African Americans and other communities of color, right? One thing that I didn't have a chance to talk about in the first segment of our conversation was the creation of Madden Park in the late 1920s, early 1930s. Ida B. Wells, the civil rights activist, storied anti-lynching activist, got involved along with the Chicago Urban League, the NAACP, in fighting for what became a 10-acre park named after a Congressman, Martin B. Madden, unveiled in the 1930s. And the story of Madden Park's sort of centrality to the Black community, especially for those who lived in the Ida B. Wells homes that sprung up right around Madden Park in the 1940s, and its subsequent decline in the 1960s and 70s until it is no longer a park, right? If you go to Google Maps and look for Madden Park right now, it doesn't exist. For those of you, who know Chicago a little bit, and I imagine most in the audience do, because it's a public library event, this park, Madden Park, was between 37th and 39th, just east of MLK Drive, or what was then South Parkway. 10 acres, a pool, baseball diamonds, a field house, a place that was a destination for people. And the disinvestment in that space, along with the disinvestment in public housing, leads to what is today a vacant lot, except for a Mariano's grocery store that's out the south end of that plot of land that used to be Madden Park. So we've seen community gathering places created by activism in communities of color. And then, decades later, disinvestment leads to the decline, and in some cases like Madden Park, the erasure of those spaces. And that's a huge loss for those communities. But the sad thing is, and that the terrible, infuriating thing is that it takes the persistent activism, it seems like, of those communities of color in order to keep those places vibrant, right? If you let up in the least, those places dwindle away, and the city does not invest in them, right? So it takes constant activism to keep those places vibrant.
And I'm so glad you brought that up. I mean, I sit on the Park Advisory Council, and many of my neighbors and friends in South Shore as well. And to your point, it takes a lot of activism. I see somebody's a hand is raised. I think I see a hand up. Question. I will answer it after this, or you can open this up, Joe, for the question. Very often, the level of creativity that we see come into the parks right now comes for many of the former activists or still existing activists. But like Fannie Lou Hamer's famous words, they're sick and tired of being sick and tired. And so despite the disinvestment and the lack of resources, the PACs were still trying to bring activities to the park. Faith in Place collaborated with the South Shore Culture Center and brought a Monarch Fest on the South Side. Before that, we had it at Garfield Park on the West Side. The whole idea, in my mind, is to bring things to the park that we know should exist anyhow, right? I'm at the Rainbow Beach Advisory PAC Council, and we brought the Kike Fest, which is always at North Beach and up north, to the South Side, and it was so amazingly received. People were so happy, and we're so sad COVID came and we weren't able to do it again. And the the owners of the Kite Fest, the people that brought the kites were like, oh my God, this beach is so beautiful. It's one of the cleanest we've ever done a Kite Fest at. This is awesome. I didn't know this was down here. I didn't know anything looked like this past the Museum of Science and Industry. So there's still that invisible line, Brian, of nothing good must be past Hyde Park, right? Nothing, there's nothing good there. So, and then the sad part about the things that we're talking about that used to be, you don't miss what you've never had. So we have young activists, great young activists. They don't even know to advocate for the skating rink, because as long as they've been born, these things had already gone. They don't know to advocate for the park that you talked about, that was in Washington Park, because from the time they got here, it never existed. And that's what systemic racism also does. It kind of numbs you. It can cause you to narrow your vision and your expectations. And it's important, those of us who are still activists in the community, to keep telling the story. That's why Migration and Me is so important. Stories like this and programs like this, what we're doing today, still important. So that people can say, you know what, we did have those things and we need them again. And to not tire and give up. I think, quite frankly, under the new administration, I know our new mayor did a tour of the lakefront and the parks, and she herself made comments that there was disparity in our communities, and she wanted to see that change. It's up to us to keep the iron in the fire to make sure that those things happen, for sure.
That seems like a good place to maybe start taking some questions. And there are a few in the question and answer section. I'll read some out. I think this might have been answered. Was the island active during the time when the picnic was first started? That's Bynum Island in Washington Park, I believe, acted the picnic for Bud Billiken. And I think we kind of answered that they were not contemporaneous. Is that accurate?
Well, I mean, yes and no. So the Bud Billiken Parade and Picnic starts in 1930 and still goes on today, right? I mean, it's a long storied tradition. So it certainly was going on in the 1970s and 80s when Bynum Adventure Playland was built. And I just want to show you an aerial view of Washington Park. This actually is not from the Chicago Park District archives at the public library, but it gives you a good sense of how large Washington Park is. This is just the southern half of the park. You have Garfield Boulevard sort of bisecting the park at the north end of frame here. The lagoon that Olmsted designed here, and Bynum Adventure Playland was on this area here in the 1970s, sort of in the middle, surrounded by the lagoon. So does not exist anymore, but certainly was concurrent with Bud Billiken Parade and Picnic for 2 decades, from the 70s through the 80s.
And I would just add that if you go there now, not only is the playground not there, but you can't even get onto that island. There are fences on both ends, which is disappointing. Okay, another question. Thank you for this wonderful talk. I recently listened to an interview with Robin D.G. Kelly. He described parks in New York City as spaces developed for socialization that were never meant to be radical, but became a commons for life-affirming activities for African Americans. Do you think Washington Park played a similar role, and would you describe it as a radical space?
Do you want to start on that one, Veronica?
You know, I will say, as a result of systemic racism, any space that people can get into, first of all, let me just say this. Respite for African Americans of any kind is a form of resistance, a radical form of resistance. So even recreation itself is radical, because we were actually kidnapped and brought over here so that we could work. So there, you know, when I think of Washington Park and any gathering space for people of color, Black and brown, that in itself is a radical movement and presence, just to be in that space and not be working and earning somebody else, doing somebody else's vision. I also feel that our open spaces, our parks, opportunities to gather, whether it's a church basement or a park or anywhere that community members feel they need to come to talk about certain issues and what's going on, or to bring about systemic change, is important. My concern right now when it comes to our parks is, are they safe for us to gather? When we see a certain group of people gather who look a certain way, that we make decisions and we come to conclusions that they might be up to no good. Things might not be, what is this all about? And I just feel like part of what we need to really talk about with these spaces, not only should they be radical spaces, are they welcoming spaces? Do people feel welcome? I think the new word after what we just went through for 4 years is, where are people welcome?
I think that's great, Veronica. I just want to point to a couple moments in history where Washington Park, and these are certainly not exhaustive in terms of how Washington Park was a conduit for radical activism in Black Chicago. But in the 1930s, it was a hotbed of communist activism and soapbox orators and so forth, organizing people, fighting against evictions in particular, when evictions, and this is perhaps all the more sadly potent in the time of COVID, right? Where thankfully there is a moratorium on evictions, or there has been at least. But evictions were rampant in the 1930s and the Depression. African Americans on the South Side unable to pay rent. Communists, other political radicals were organizing in Washington Park. They would hear about an eviction and immediately mobilize and go to that place where the eviction was happening and forcibly put people's belongings back in their apartments. Now, without the space of Washington Park, which was open, allowing for the congregation of hundreds of people very, very easily and very, very quickly, I don't know that that kind of sort of political activism would have been as possible, right, in a different place, right? The park has a unique sort of function there. So there's a long storied history of that in the 1930s of radical organizing in Washington Park that dates prior to that, prior to it becoming a predominantly African-American space. Soapbox orators and political radicals frequented Washington Park. And I also want to point to the 1960s and 1970s. At the moment when we're talking about the Rainbow Beach wade-ins along the lakefront, Washington Park was also a hotbed of activism against inequality in Chicago public schools, obviously still a hot button issue in the city today. But in the era of Willis wagons and segregation in schools in the 1960s, marches were led around the South Side, culminating in Washington Park, right? So it's not just a community place for people to come together and celebrate, like at the Bud Billiken picnic. It's also a place for the African-American community and others to mobilize, right, to organize. Jesse Jackson's Operation Breadbasket in the late 60s, early 70s, briefly fought for renaming Washington Park Malcolm X Park, which sort of signifies the political radicalism in that era, at least, that was associated with Washington Park, and that it was a Black space, right? So, that sort of history, which Chicago has experienced in the 21st century with Douglas Park on the west side being renamed Frederick Douglass Park, right? Instead of after Stephen Douglas, that kind of impulse to and fight to rename places that have become de facto Black spaces, whether for recreation or political organizing, that dates back to the 60s and 70s and even before.
And I just want to add with that, I feel as if it's important that those spaces existed for those opportunities, particularly with the reality of the way housing was set up. I want to repeat again, there wasn't a lot of other places to do the kind of organizing other than in the park. I mean, when we talk about taking it to the streets, what people really meant very often was taking it to that gathering space, that neutral space without walls, where a large number of people can come and be heard. I mean, we saw that happening in Birmingham with the dogs. I mean, people go where they feel they can have camaraderie, where they can be able to speak and be safe. And very often it wasn't safe to have things in your home or in your church. You needed to come somewhere neutral. It wasn't safe to gather in your home. And we surely learned something about that with the bombing of the church in Birmingham. So I don't know who raised the question, but I'm kind of glad it came up. I think very often, again, this way in which Black folk were, and most people, particularly people who feel oppressed, are forced to kind of come together in whatever space they feel comfortable, and there's enough and they're loud. But it also puts you at risk, because when you're out in the park, you can get hosed, you can get sprayed. We've just seen all this happen in front of our face, right? We also saw, what happens when you think that you're, regardless, that you have some kind of right that you can just move and take over anyway. I'm still cringing at what I saw in the insurrection based on what I saw just a few months, in the summer with Black Lives Matter. And I just wonder if we had taken over a park or space by what we saw, I think there would have been so much bloodshed on the streets several weeks ago. We would all be still holding our eyes in horror. So even when we gathered in the park, it came at a risk.
And I just want to piggyback on that really briefly, Veronica. I think, I would be remiss if during the week of the Martin Luther King Jr. holiday, if we didn't name check the Chicago Freedom Movement and Martin Luther King and loads of local activists who had been working on these kinds of housing inequality and education inequality issues before Martin Luther King even came to town in 1966. But that is tied to the parks as well, right? It was in Marquette Park on the southwest side.
Marquette, absolutely.
Yeah, where King and activists are marching to try to integrate those neighborhoods, where he is hit with a rock in the head, right? And it prompts him to say that with all of his marching and organizing in the South, he had never seen racism so virulent as he did in Chicago.
Absolutely.
Right. And in part, it was that incident, in large part, that incident in Marquette Park that led him to say that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I think we might have time for one more question here. It says, I love this idea of resurrecting skills that can help us repair and extend the life of the things we own. How can we generate support for these kinds of programs, and how can we put an emphasis on supporting the implementation of these programs in communities on South and West sides?
Not quite sure, who's asking the question, but what I will say is, reach out to people on the ground with boots on the ground in these communities. Reach out to Block Club leaders, reach out to the Alderman's office if you have the resources and connection. And also, wouldn't it be an incredible opportunity for healing right now in Chicago if we could have some collaborative efforts to begin to truly bring life and regenerate and also recreate and reach out to young people. They know what they need and know what they want. Faith in Place did some conversation circles with young people on the West Side, Brian, a year before COVID. And without question, from the 7-year-old to the 17, they told us exactly what they needed. And many of them said, we don't just need a basketball net. We want to feel safe. I want to learn. One of them said, I want to learn how to play hockey. Well, you need some ice, right? You need something, right? So they had, I want to know how to play tennis. I like a garden. So collaboration, reaching out to local people. If you are of influence, whether it's through corporate or government or whatever, begin to talk about appropriating resources to these areas. Become, you don't have to be friends of the park. Just be about wanting to do right and bring some healing to the country and where we are right now. And I think more than ever, our young people need to see us, Black, Brown, Indigenous, Asian, all coming together to be able to build a city that says that young people, we care about you, we want to invest in you. We want to make sure that you have the best, whatever's in Lincoln Park, we also want to see it in Argyle Gardens. We want to see it on Rainbow Beach. We want to see it in Washington Park. We want to see it in Woodlawn. That, to me, between the parks and the schools, if we could do this, I know we would probably reduce crime in this city. This is all about deprivation. This is all about lack. And what we want to do, when I have a 7-year-old tell me, little boy, that I met when I came back in 2006, he said to me, I met him in 2009, and I said, what do you want to be when you grow up? And he said, alive. I said, no, 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 no. What do you want to be? Like astronaut? Or he said, alive, miss. And I looked confused with my naive self because I've been a dreamer all my life. And one of the little boys came to me and said, every young man in his family is dead, miss. And they all were dead by the time they were 25. So for him, it's to say he wants to be alive, we should be ashamed of ourselves in this country. You know, when a 7-year-old can't dream. And a young man told me on the bus, we have 4 types of people in our community now, miss. The have-nots, the never will have, and don't even know they can have. That's sad. That's what systemic racism does. When you can't dream, Brian, you don't hope. You can't hope, you can't dream, you're not gonna try. And so if we can invest in our parks and in our schools, I think we can do a lot to bring about some of the healing and reduce some of the trauma that we're all suffering from in the city. These carjackings and everything, this is trauma, right? We're all now, people scared as hell. But you can bet there's been some disinvestment. Wherever those young men are who are doing this is about disinvestment, for sure.
All right, well, I think we're unfortunately at time. I would like to sit and listen to you guys keep talking for forever. This has been fascinating, and I really appreciate the call to action as well. So thank you to Brian and Veronica for speaking with us, and thank you to everyone for participating. And we hope you come to another Chicago Public Library program soon.
Thank you, Joanna, Chloe. Thank you, Brian.
Veronica,
it was great seeing you again.
Yeah.